I'm Julia Muggeridge with Electricity Canada. I'm the Vice President of Corporate Affairs, and I'm here with Michael Powell, Vice President of Government Relations. Hello! So, yesterday was a really big day for our sector. Prime Minister Carney announced a much-anticipated national electricity strategy. You were at the announcement with Francis. How did it go?
Well, it was a long time coming. We've been anticipating the release of the strategy or green paper or discussion document. The government's described it in different ways over the last 6 months. And we've actually been building our advocacy focus since really the end of last year around what do we want to see in this strategy and what do we want to see reflected in our priorities. And, we were pretty happy with what came out. There was a big focus on how do we build a grid faster. There's a big focus on how to make sure that we do so in a way that's affordably, reflecting that not everything can just be borne by ratepayers. We saw a focus on better connecting Canada's different electricity systems. And we saw a focus on making sure that we have the stuff and the people to actually build the system.
You're getting ahead of yourself. As a communications person, I want to talk about optics. Why was the Prime Minister making this announcement? This feels like something that should have been made by Minister Hodgson.
Nope, this is absolutely a priority of the government. I think one thing we've seen is that the government's agenda is very much the Prime Minister's agenda. And we're in a pretty unique space in the electricity sector where the senior most people in government, the Prime Minister, the Clerk of the Privy Council, and Minister Hodgson, are all also electricity people. And so I think it says something that the Prime Minister chose to use his big announcement for the day to focus on how we're going to build out the electricity system and tie that to the government's agenda and really Canada's economic agenda.
So maybe also on optics and, as you mentioned, leadership on the electricity side. I saw scattered throughout the report mention of Hydro-Quebec. Mm-hmm. So it was clear that Michael Sabia, the Privy Council, was actively involved in that. Was he at the announcement yesterday?
I didn't see him, but he's a pretty busy guy. I think the thing to remember is that for sure, Mr. Sabia was at Hydro-Quebec. He used to be Deputy Minister of Finance, and so we saw some of his work from that era reflected in the document as well, both in expanding the investment tax credits and some of the conversations around longer-term financing. I mean, ultimately, Canada's electricity system is built at its base on strong hydroelectricity in some of our provinces, one of which is Quebec. And there's a pretty ambitious agenda to build out the system in Quebec and better connect to other provinces as well. So I think it ties into a lot of what was being talked about in the strategy either way.
So the document released yesterday felt like more of a promise of more things to come. And we've seen that many times during the last Prime Minister as well. Maybe let's talk about what this wasn't. So was this a strategy that was released yesterday or the promise of a future strategy?
I think it's absolutely a strategy, but it doesn't have all the details in it. And what we see is the government saying where it sees its need for a federal role in the electricity system and where it is putting a flag in some priorities. And that is in how do you have some national coordination between disparate systems? How do you better connect provinces? And mostly, how do you finance this thing? There is the government talked about a $1 trillion investment. We said $2 trillion in our state of the industry. It really doesn't matter. That's a lot of zeros. And so I think what we see from this is the federal government being very clear that it sees a role for the national government in helping coordinate, helping build, helping finance, recognizing that provinces have a leadership role in this, but that we all have to be in this together. There's a lot to come. There's a lot of details to happen, but that's okay. We know we're in the right direction. And so we'll be working at Electricity Canada to make sure we fill in those details in a way that works with the system.
Right. So filling in those details seems like the next 4 months of work. So
it absolutely is. Maybe next year.
So the report was 35 pages and then like 4 pages of questions. Who will these questions be brought to and how is it basically just going to be like a roundtable with all of Canada for the next 4 months?
So already there's engagement happening between the federal and provincial governments on electricity issues. I know there's going to be a major focus on interties and electricity systems at the Energy and Mines Ministerial Meeting, which is Minister Hodgson and his provincial counterparts, which is taking place in the summer. And even today, the Prime Minister and Danielle Smith are having a meeting on the Alberta-Canada MOU, part of which does relate to electricity, even if that's not the thing everyone's talking about. And I think organizations like ours are going to play a big role. We've been very engaged with Natural Resources Canada. We've been very engaged with PCO and PMO, Major Projects Office, with ECCC. And so it'll be on us in the next months to gather member feedback and input, and then make sure that we as a sector have a cohesive submission as we move in. Like, as an example, one of the big announcements for us was an update to the clean electricity regulations, which was a major focus of my team over the last 3 years. We get to get the band back together. And so we'll be working with Environment and Climate Change Canada to navigate that process, which could take the better part of a year.
Right. So we'll get back to some of the details. Maybe just to wrap up, like the actual document and what yesterday was. Where does this lead to? When can we expect a more fulsome strategy?
I think we can see more details on some of the big pieces in the fall budget. What we've heard from the Prime Minister yesterday and what we've had in conversations is that there's not really there isn't a firm sort of deadline for comment. The process of government leads its way through the budget process, which, even though we'll probably see the actual budget delivered in November, the big ticket items will be wrapped up over the summer. So our work is cut out for us between now and Labor Day.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the content. I know you've talked about interties, you've talked about the CPRs. Our team yesterday, when we were excitedly reviewing the document, noted that transmission did feel like the big winner. I fell asleep thinking about transmission lines. So let's start by talking about intra-provincial transmission and what was the big winner there in this strategy.
Well, I'd say that there's winners across the system, but from an obvious near-term benefit, I think intra-provincial transmission, so transmission within provinces, is a really big winner. One of the gaps in Canada's investment tax credit regime, which is how the federal government most directly supports electricity investments, has been that there really hasn't been funding or tax supports for wires within provinces. And that we've been asking for this for a long period of time. We've been underlining that it's all well and good to connect provinces together, but you have to color in the lines as well. What we saw yesterday was an announcement that they're going to expand the ITCs to include some of that. And that reflects work that we've done. It reflects advice from the Electricity Advisory Council. There's details to be figured out. It won't be everything, but I think even having the big stuff in place is a win for affordability, and it's a win for getting projects built.
I feel like it's something that we've been hearing about a lot. Like, you and I were in Alberta last week. We were hearing about generation assets in Alberta that are stranded. So this promise of support for intra-provincial will be very helpful. Right, on to interties. This has been something we've been talking about a lot at Electricity Canada since Mark Carney released his platform last April. And I feel like this was the first time we've seen real movement outside of the Major Projects Office on interties and further discussion on that.
I think, in the last 2 years, there's been a real change in Canada, the conversation of interties. It used to be that they were, nice to have, but there wasn't an urgency in expanding them. And I think since Mark Carney was elected, there's been a sea change in that conversation. Yesterday was the clearest articulation of where the federal government sees its role, and there was a whole chapter in the document. There is a push to the Major Projects Office to figure out how these things are financed. There was very clear calls for, and some of the stuff that we've been advocating for years, for regional planning, for benefit allocation, for funding. But this is building on momentum that we've seen at the provincial level as well. This isn't the federal government going out on a limb and saying this is where we think the future is. It's a recognition that there's a provincial conversation that's happening as well. That the document actually talks about the MOU that Ontario has signed with many of the other provinces in Canada. So we're at a unique spot where the federal and provincial governments and our members more and more are aligned in the direction that we need to go. And that's a good spot to be in to see interties both.
And we saw yesterday in the news that the Prime Minister made mention of the opportunity between Newfoundland and Quebec. And that there's a real opportunity for the federal government to play a role in this benefit identification between those two provinces, which I think is a big win.
It's a real big win. I think one of the challenges, and this isn't unique to Canada, is that once you have an intertie built, everyone kind of figures out that there's a lot of use to it. But two different parties on either side can be hard to identify exactly where that win could be. And we saw that in other places in Canada. I think it was one of the challenges early on in the Atlantic Loop conversations. And so now we're seeing a smaller but still important intertie being built there. I think anything the federal government can do to help facilitate these conversations in a way that connects resources with people is a good thing. There's real opportunities to expand the Prime Minister said this in the questions and answers, to continue to expand power production in Labrador. And Quebec needs power. There's an obvious win-win there. And so how can the feds help navigate that process?
I think of everything I read in the strategy yesterday, this was the word that stuck out the most to me was willingness, and that we need provinces that are willing to participate and to build more interties. So it seems like the government is there and ready to support willing partners in further connections.
And I think one of the interesting thing here is that there's a lot of willingness in lots of places. And I think there's probably some very near-term wins, and the government wants to land those. There's political imperative to that. But there's a utility, literally, to that as well. And then how do you set up this future for that to be self-proving? And I think you've done some work on enterprise for Electricity Canada. The opportunity is to lock in some early successes and then build from that as we build a more integrated, connected national system. We don't need to have it all be done all at once. It can be iterative and little pieces built of bigger pieces. And I think that's probably why there's a focus on what those near-term wins are now.
So we're looking forward to seeing what comes from this. Let's move on to CERs. So you've talked about this a little bit briefly. Reflecting on the sentiment from the media that we saw yesterday, we saw a lot of positive responses, and I would say that the negative responses are what we anticipated. NGOs that are frustrated with the clean electricity regulations being reopened and reconsidered. Reflect on that. I know that this has been a major part of your work for the last couple of years.
I think, fair enough that there'd be questions about a change that moves away from a policy from before, and that's sort of the obvious tension point. I think the fact of the matter is that the electricity regulations that were passed in the last government don't work in all parts of Canada, that they dictate system operation choices to jurisdictions. They are expensive, and mostly they don't produce a lot of emissions reductions, that you add a lot of cost and a lot of risk, but not a lot of megatons that are produced. I think one of the really important things this strategy emphasizes, something that we've talked about for a long time, is that the real opportunity for Canada's electricity system is to decarbonize other parts of the economy. We've already done the heavy lifting in reducing emissions in the sector. We're down 50% since 2005, or we're below 50 or 60 megatons now. So the opportunity is to leverage electricity generation, which is cleaner than most other places in the world, to decarbonize cars, decarbonize buildings, to decarbonize industrial process, to grow the economy. And then as we expand to new generation, in the future, we'll see more renewables, more hydro, more interconnections, more nuclear, which will be non-emitting. And so I think what we're really excited about is an opportunity to take advantage, to revisit the CERs, and then leverage the equipment that we already have built. Be it the gas plants that are existing as peakers, be there for base load that can support growth. Those are really important. And in places like Saskatchewan, Alberta, and even Ontario, that's essential to the system.
One of the main messages that we offered to the government during our discussions with them on the clean electricity regulations was that there are going to be issues with affordability. So that seemed to be a prominent part of the national electricity strategy yesterday as well, was this feedback from the Prime Minister that there are affordability challenges that are ahead of us. He's looking to ensure that the taxpayer and ratepayer are both part of this. But from a financing perspective in general, what were your thoughts on how they addressed affordability in yesterday's announcement?
Yeah, certainly from a CER's perspective, it doesn't make sense to turn off power plants that you already have that are working. I think as we look to the build out, and the document talks a lot about this, is that the scale of how we build things in the electricity space is greater than what we've seen before with how we built in the past. So traditionally, electricity relies on rate base, so on your bill, which is amortized over time. But when you start looking at spending trillions of dollars on electricity equipment and electricity stuff, while also refurbishing and holding what you have as we dump with the grid, that gets bigger than can be handled by the bill. It gets bigger than can be handled by this generation, next generation, and this government and next government. And so I think there's a really interesting reflection on how do you balance that over time and governance. And so there's clearly a role for the federal government and the tax base that can sort of smooth the peanut butter over time and make sure that what you're seeing is on when you pay your bill, you're paying, what is fair for what you use, and that future generations are paying for what they are going to use. And that's how we do a lot of infrastructure in Canada. Electricity is pretty unique. We haven't built roads that way. We haven't built highways that way. We haven't built ports that way. And so it's, I think, very important that we're starting to think about the electricity system as national infrastructure, as critical infrastructure, and then funding it the same way that we do healthcare and ports and other transportation.
My sense was that the government doesn't have a clear path forward on this, but yesterday's announcement posed an invitation for new ideas. And several of the questions within the back end of the report were about financing and how they can make this work. So this feels like a real opportunity.
Yeah, I think they probably have some ideas, but I think that they're open to the question and thinking about it is a really good sign. And again, this speaks to what we've been talking about at Electricity Canada for some time. And so we see that as a really big opportunity for pushing forward.
So this announcement yesterday comes on the heels of an announcement last week on red tape reduction, and another paper that's being prepared over the next several weeks, shorter time frame. How do these two papers connect?
I think the way they connect is that there's an urgency for movement in this government, and it's really on them to deliver. I think we're here to do the work, and our members are ready to build. But if you were to go back the last 4 or 5 governments, the usual focus is on, how do we get projects built? How do we cut red tape? How do we make sure that, we can attract investment and get businesses to make investment decisions? I think the test here with all this movement is to see it actually materialize. I think we can be pretty optimistic. The Major Projects Office, which was the focus of the work last week, is in a lot in the strategy yesterday as well, really are showing that the government's willing to think differently, and we'll see how that materializes over the next few months.
I know that we're going to have a very busy couple of months because the federal government indicated that they want to talk to provinces, Indigenous leaders, energy stakeholders, which I put us in that category, and unions. So the next 4 weeks, we have to submit to this red tape reduction paper. We're going to be consulting with them and participating in their discussions. This is a really big opportunity for us. So maybe we should end on that. Next couple months, what does this look like for Electricity Canada? How can we participate? What should we ask for from our members in order to be, active and open with the government during this process?
I think what's very helpful is that there's a clear list of questions and areas of focus, and they happen to align with a lot of the work that we've already been doing with our members and our various councils and committees. So in the next, we've already got to start off as identifying what information we already have that might be useful for the questions that we anticipated, and where do we have gaps. And so we'll be working with our members to fill those in, to build a consensus position. And I think really provide detail and granularity to government. This is not a time where we need to be high level. I think there's a desire for specificity, and there's a desire for nuance. And I think we heard a recognition that, what works in Ontario or Nova Scotia or Alberta might be different. And so, we can leverage that and provide a single voice for that. So, but being busy is good. That's what we're here for.
So right before we sat down, there were certain words that you wanted to get out. And one of them that you haven't said is pace. So let's just talk pace and then we'll wrap it up there.
Well, we've put out 7 states of the industry, and all have said that we need to get moving to double size the grid by 2050. And every megawatt we don't build today is another we have to build tomorrow. It would be really great when we start turning around and writing the 2027 state of the industry that we can say, actually, we are moving. Yeah. And I think what we've seen is that it doesn't get easier as we go along. It's harder to find equipment. People are going to be committed to other tasks, and we risk missing out. I think if we are short on power, then it means that we can't build new homes. It means that we can't attract businesses. It means that we can't grow the economy, and that has a real cost on people. So we can't miss out on the opportunity, and I think that's where focus and keeping moving is essential.
Great. Well, thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Go Habs, go.